Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for March 16th, 2022. What I'll be reporting on is the continuing war mobilization from the transatlantic world and the worsening economic crisis, which seems to be driving countries to make a decision to break with the existing so-called rules-based order or unipolar order under the City of London Wall Street financial policies. So let's start with the pace of diplomacy, which is clearly in an accelerated pace right now. The Western war hawks are trying to sustain the sense of unity as they're going for an increased devastation in their war drive, economic war drive against Russia. There are a number of events. Ukrainian President Zelensky yesterday addressed the Canadian Parliament. This morning he'll be addressing the U.S. Congress, where you can be sure that the war hawk bought puppets of the Congress will be jumping up and down cheering him as he calls for their support to defeat Russia. The Biden administration has already pledged more aid. In the budget that was passed a couple of days ago, $13.6 billion of money is now headed toward Ukrainian weapons and support. Biden added $800 million to that yesterday. So we're seeing a huge chunk of money going to this Ukrainian war drive. At the same point, money is being cut from COVID relief for states and families in the United States. So we also have what has to be seen as a publicity stunt. The presidents of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia hopped on a train to Kiev to show up there to pledge their support to the Ukrainian people. You have Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is in Brussels today for a NATO meeting, and Biden is now scheduled to go to Europe next week for a NATO and a European Union summit. And then on the 15th of March, yesterday, there was a meeting between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and his counterpart from China, where Sullivan supposedly told the Chinese they should stay out of the U.S. way. They should not help Russia. They should instead support U.S. efforts to isolate Russia. That's not going to happen, but it just shows the delusional state of mind that dominates the people who are pushing for a destruction of Russia. And why is that? We've been reporting this. There are two aspects to it. And the simple one, the one that people like to think is that, well, war is good for business, for the military-industrial complex. And indeed it is. There are all kinds of new orders coming into defense contractors for weapons. The Germans are going to increase their defense budget by 100 billion euros. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is to continue to sustain the power of this idea of a unipolar order, a Wall Street, City of London, corporate conglomerate control of the world economy over and above the heads of sovereign nations, including not really helping the U.S. or the European countries, but will benefit totally the corporate oligarchy. And the whole idea of this is they cannot accept the idea of an alternative system. And they're pushing ahead with their plans for the Great Reset, which is a global central banker's dictatorship, to do what? To impose the Green New Deal, which will have a radical reduction of population. This is the Malthusian dream, to use the confluence of war and economic crisis to demand sacrifice. And among those sacrifices are people freezing to death and starving to death because of the collapse of world food supplies and the breakdown of a global energy system. Now, in the meantime, while this is underway, there's not much talk in the media of what really is causing the concern for the West, which is the tectonic shift which occurred. Actually, it has been occurring, but was consolidated with the February 4th meeting of Russian President Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping, where they signed a series of economic agreements of tremendous importance. The idea of a Russia-China alliance as an integration of the Eurasian countries with the Asian countries, which could easily incorporate the Western European countries if they weren't so scared of the British and the Americans. What would happen if you had Western Europe, Russia, and China in an economic alliance? You couldn't continue the present International Monetary Fund, World Bank policy of looting the poorer countries and looting the vast majority of the population of the so-called wealthy nations. It wouldn't work. The fact that the Western system is collapsing and is supposedly going to be held together now through war and through the control, the destruction of the alternative, is just not going to happen. So what we're seeing now is the implications of this February 4th agreement, which includes deals on coal, construction of nuclear plants, rail and infrastructure, grain. Grain is very important. Food production. The Russians are becoming a major exporter of food. In 2021, China was Russia's largest trade partner, both for imports to Russia and exports from Russia to China. And the sanctions which are being imposed on Russia are driving Russia and China closer together to a potential break with the Western dollar system. Now, this was the subject of a discussion of a video conference on March 11th, which took place between the Eurasian Economic Union and China. And they discussed adopting a new economic system to address the, quote, common challenges and risks associated with the global economic slowdown and restrictive measures against the Eurasian Union and Chinese states, unquote. That's a direct reference to the effect of sanctions and economic warfare. And it was announced they are going to be drafting proposals toward moving toward a new system. And one of the people at the center of this is Sergei Glaziev, a co-thinker of Lyndon LaRouche, someone who has very similar ideas to LaRouche when it comes to how you must fund the physical economy as opposed to speculation, and how nations have to have a regulatory system of banking and credit policy that makes ample credit available for those things which are good for the society, but restricts credit for the speculators, the war industries, and the people like George Soros, the people who will destroy economies to make a quick buck. So with someone like Sergei Glaziev, who is a key figure in the Eurasian Economic Union pushing this, it's clear that the Russia-China agreement is more toward an American system approach of national banking. And by national banking, I mean banking which ensures that the credit that's generated is going into something which is good for the nation, as opposed to what's good for the oligarchs. So this is something that was discussed on March 11th. Another factor in this, the Saudis are discussing with China pricing their oil sales in yuan, which would mean a huge increase in yuan traffic, especially if the Saudis continue to sell the amount of oil they are to China. Now, maybe this has something to do with Boris Johnson's trip to the United Arab Emirates and to Saudi Arabia. He's going there supposedly to ask them to provide more oil, given the fear that there are going to be shortages in Europe, especially if Russian oil sales are cut. But he may also be going there to exert pressure on the Saudis to not move into this new arrangement. But the Saudis are not happy with what the British and the US are demanding of them. Nor are other nations. There are many other nations that are unhappy with the dollar system. And it's a legitimate concern. Why keep your national reserves in dollars if they're subject to sanctions and seizure, as the US seized the funds of Afghanistan and has seized over $300 billion of foreign reserves of Russia? Why would any country willingly do that? And so the Saudis may be looking at an option, and other countries as well. This is what EIR editor Paul Gallagher has called the boomerang effect. That is, that in reaction to these policies of economic war against Russia, countries are asking the question, why would we go along with a system which would destroy an important power like Russia? And all you have to do, especially if you're one of the smaller countries, is look at how the West treated Iraq and Syria and Libya and Afghanistan. For those people who are saying, oh, look how terrible Russia is in Ukraine, the people pointing the fingers the most are the ones who destroyed cities in Iraq and Syria and conducted genocidal warfare in Afghanistan and are continuing a genocide against the people of Yemen. So is it time to move from this dollar system? It's bankrupt. It cannot sustain itself. There's not enough production to cover even the interest on the debt that's been accrued. So when we see motions such as this Eurasian economic meeting with the Chinese, when we see the kind of proposals coming from the Belt and Road Initiative for joint multiple engagement in work on infrastructure, on energy, on maritime and trade, you see a way out of the collapse of this system. That's what the oligarchs of London, Wall Street, and Washington are trying to stop. And that's why Bloomberg News had a headline today, Globalization at Risk. Good. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again tomorrow.